Sarah sat in her corner office on the 32nd floor, staring out at the city skyline as another 18-hour workday came to an end. At 38, she had everything she thought she wanted: a six-figure salary, professional recognition, financial independence, and the respect of her peers. Yet, as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, she felt like she was looking at a stranger. Somewhere between achieving everything society told her would make her happy, she had lost something essential about herself that she couldn't even name. What Sarah didn't realize was that she was experiencing what Carl Jung identified nearly a century ago: the psychological fragmentation that occurs when an entire generation of women becomes disconnected from their archetypal foundation. Jung discovered that within every woman's psyche exists what he called the archetypal feminine, a deep instinctual pattern of being that encompasses intuition, emotional wisdom, cyclical thinking, and nurturing power. This isn't about traditional gender roles or cultural expectations. It's about fundamental psychological structures that exist at the core of feminine identity. When women become disconnected from this archetypal foundation, they experience a profound sense of lostness that no external achievement can remedy. The modern epidemic of women feeling unfulfilled despite unprecedented opportunities isn't a failure of feminism or progress. It's the psychological consequence of what Jung called archetypal dissociation. Women have been encouraged to develop their masculine qualities: logic, competition, linear thinking, achievement, while simultaneously being taught to suppress or ignore their feminine archetypal nature. This creates an internal split that manifests as chronic dissatisfaction, anxiety, and a persistent feeling that something crucial is missing. Have you ever achieved something you worked years for, only to find that the satisfaction felt hollow and temporary, as if you were living someone else's version of success? Sarah's journey to this point of professional success had required her to systematically suppress every quality that felt naturally feminine. In business school, she learned to argue aggressively, think purely in terms of metrics and outcomes, and present herself as rationally detached from emotional considerations. She prided herself on being one of the guys, never letting personal relationships interfere with professional goals, never showing vulnerability, and never acknowledging the cyclical nature of her energy and creativity. This wasn't conscious self-betrayal. It was survival in a system that seemed to reward only masculine approaches to achievement. Sarah had internalized the message that feminine qualities like intuition, emotional intelligence, and collaborative thinking were weaknesses to be overcome rather than strengths to be developed. She had spent 2 decades systematically training herself out of her own archetypal nature. Jung understood that this kind of archetypal betrayal creates what he called psychological neurosis, a state where the conscious personality becomes completely misaligned with the deeper patterns of the psyche. Women experiencing this disconnection often describe feeling like they're acting in a play where they've memorized all the lines, but forgotten who they really are beneath the performance. The archetypal feminine that Jung identified isn't about being passive, emotional, or traditionally domestic. It's about a fundamentally different way of processing reality, one that values relationships over achievements, cycles over linear progress, depth over surface success, and wisdom over mere knowledge. When women suppress these archetypal patterns to fit into systems designed around masculine values, they create internal conflicts that manifest as chronic stress, relationship difficulties, and existential emptiness. Sarah's personal life reflected this archetypal fragmentation. Her relationships felt superficial because she had learned to approach them with the same goal-oriented mindset she used at work. She dated men based on logical compatibility rather than genuine connection, analyzed her friendships for strategic value, and had become so disconnected from her emotional intuition that she couldn't recognize what she actually wanted or needed from others. The modern workplace, Jung would argue, is structured around what he called masculine consciousness: linear time, hierarchical competition, rational analysis, and the suppression of cyclical and intuitive approaches to problem solving. Women who succeed in these environments often do so by adopting masculine archetypal patterns, while abandoning their own psychological foundation. This creates professional success at the cost of psychological wholeness. Jung's concept of the persona becomes particularly relevant for understanding modern women's struggles. The persona is the mask we wear to function in society. But when the persona becomes completely disconnected from the authentic archetypal self, it creates profound psychological suffering. Many successful women have developed personas so effective at navigating masculine-oriented systems that they've lost contact with their own archetypal nature. Sarah recognized this pattern in herself when she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had made a decision based on intuition rather than analysis, or chosen something because it felt right rather than because it made logical sense. She had become so practiced at suppressing her natural psychological patterns that she no longer trusted or even recognized them when they emerged. Can you think of moments when you knew something was right or wrong at a deep level, but talked yourself out of that knowing because it wasn't rational or practical? The archetypal feminine operates through what Jung called circular consciousness, a way of thinking that embraces paradox, values emotional wisdom, and understands that truth often emerges through relationship and intuitive insight rather than logical analysis. Modern education and professional training systematically discourage this type of consciousness in favor of linear, analytical approaches that align with masculine archetypal patterns. Jung discovered that when women suppress their archetypal feminine nature, they often overcompensate by becoming what he called animus possessed, dominated by rigid, argumentative, and overly rational approaches that feel forced and inauthentic. This possession manifests as an inability to access emotional wisdom, chronic overthinking, and a disconnection from the body's natural rhythms and signals. Sarah's health problems, chronic insomnia, digestive issues, and hormonal imbalances were her body's way of expressing the psychological conflict between her authentic archetypal nature and the persona she had constructed for professional success. Jung understood that archetypal suppression always manifests physically, because the psyche and body are interconnected systems that cannot be permanently misaligned without consequences. The modern epidemic of anxiety and depression among successful women often stems from this archetypal disconnection. When women achieve external success using strategies that violate their deepest psychological patterns, they experience a form of existential crisis that no amount of therapy focused on surface-level issues can resolve. The problem isn't with their achievements, it's with the psychological cost of those achievements. Jung's solution wasn't for women to abandon their accomplishments or retreat into traditional roles, but to learn what he called archetypal integration, the conscious development of both masculine and feminine psychological capacities in service of authentic wholeness. This requires recognizing that feminine archetypal patterns aren't limitations to be overcome, but essential aspects of psychological health that must be honored and developed. Sarah's transformation began when she started paying attention to the cyclical nature of her energy and creativity, instead of trying to maintain constant linear productivity. She noticed that her best insights came during periods of reflection and intuitive processing rather than forced analytical thinking. She began trusting her emotional responses to people and situations as valuable information rather than weaknesses to be ignored. This wasn't about becoming more traditionally feminine. It was about reclaiming psychological approaches that felt authentic to her deeper nature. Sarah learned to value collaboration over competition, depth over surface achievement, and sustainable cycles over burnout-inducing linear progress. These changes didn't make her less effective professionally. They made her more genuinely successful, because her achievements aligned with her authentic psychological patterns. Jung understood that the archetypal feminine includes what he called the wise woman, the aspect of feminine psychology that understands cycles, embraces change, and values emotional and relational wisdom. Modern culture often dismisses these capacities as irrelevant to real success, but Jung argued that societies that suppress archetypal feminine wisdom become imbalanced and ultimately destructive. The current mental health crisis among young women reflects this archetypal crisis on a collective level. A generation of women has been raised to believe that success requires adopting masculine psychological patterns while suppressing their own archetypal nature. The result is unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and existential confusion among women who have achieved everything they were told would make them happy. Have you ever felt like you're successful according to external measures, but deeply unfulfilled in ways you can't quite articulate or explain to others? Jung's insights about archetypal psychology suggest that the solution isn't to abandon achievements or professional goals, but to pursue them in ways that honor rather than violate. Feminine archetypal patterns. This might mean valuing intuitive decision-making alongside analytical thinking, embracing cyclical rather than linear approaches to productivity, and prioritizing relational wisdom and emotional intelligence as essential professional skills. Sarah's career actually accelerated once she began integrating her archetypal feminine nature into her professional approach. Her intuitive insights about market trends proved more accurate than purely analytical predictions. Her collaborative leadership style created more innovative and productive teams. Her ability to understand the emotional dynamics of business relationships gave her advantages that purely rational approaches couldn't provide. The archetypal feminine includes what Jung called the mother, not just biological mothering, but the psychological capacity for nurturing growth, creating supportive environments, and understanding the developmental needs of individuals and communities. Modern professional environments often undervalue these capacities, but organizations led by women who have integrated their archetypal nature consistently outperform those that operate through purely masculine approaches. Jung discovered that archetypal integration doesn't happen through conscious effort alone. It requires what he called active imagination, the practice of dialoguing with unconscious archetypal patterns to understand their wisdom and needs. Sarah learned to pay attention to her dreams, trust her bodily sensations, and create space for the non-rational forms of knowing that her analytical training had taught her to dismiss. The feminine archetype also encompasses what Jung called the lover, the capacity for deep emotional connection, passionate engagement with life, and the understanding that meaning often emerges through relationship rather than individual achievement. Women who have suppressed this archetypal pattern often find their lives feeling mechanical and emotionally flat, regardless of their external success. Sarah's relationships transformed as she reconnected with her archetypal nature. Instead of approaching dating as a strategic exercise in finding compatible credentials, she began trusting her emotional and intuitive responses to potential partners. Instead of maintaining superficial friendships based on professional networking, she cultivated deeper connections based on genuine mutual care and understanding. Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, requires integrating all aspects of the psyche, including archetypal patterns that society may discourage or undervalue. For modern women, this often means reclaiming feminine archetypal capacities that have been dismissed as irrelevant to contemporary success while maintaining the valuable masculine qualities they've developed. The path to archetypal integration isn't about rejecting achievements or adopting traditional gender roles. It's about finding ways to honor authentic psychological patterns while pursuing meaningful goals. This might mean structuring work schedules around natural energy cycles, valuing emotional and relational intelligence as professional assets, and trusting intuitive insights alongside analytical thinking. If you recognize yourself in Sarah's story, if you felt the emptiness that comes from achieving success through self-betrayal, share this with other women who need to understand that their feelings of lostness aren't personal failures, but symptoms of archetypal disconnection. Subscribe to join a community of women committed to authentic success rather than hollow achievement. Like this video if you believe that true fulfillment comes from honoring your deepest psychological nature while pursuing meaningful goals. Sarah's transformation from archetypal fragmentation to integration took time and conscious effort, but the results affected every aspect of her life. Her work became more sustainable and genuinely satisfying because it aligned with her authentic psychological patterns. Her relationships deepened, because she could offer genuine connection rather than strategic networking. Her health improved because she was no longer forcing her body to sustain psychological patterns that violated her archetypal nature. Jung's insights about the feminine archetype reveal that the current epidemic of women feeling lost and unfulfilled isn't a personal problem requiring individual fixes. It's a collective crisis requiring cultural recognition of archetypal wisdom that has been systematically suppressed. The solution isn't returning to traditional roles, but creating new approaches to success that honor the full range of human psychological capacities. The archetypal feminine that Jung identified includes capacities for cyclical thinking, emotional wisdom, intuitive insight, collaborative leadership, and the understanding that sustainable success requires honoring natural rhythms rather than forcing linear productivity. These aren't limitations or outdated qualities. They're essential psychological capacities that modern culture desperately needs. Women who successfully integrate their archetypal nature don't become less ambitious or capable. They become more authentically powerful because their achievements align with their deepest psychological patterns. They can pursue challenging goals without betraying their essential nature, create success without sacrificing their psychological health, and lead others without abandoning their archetypal wisdom. The lost feeling that characterizes so many modern women's experience isn't a sign of personal inadequacy. It's the psyche's signal that archetypal patterns essential to psychological wholeness have been suppressed or ignored. Jung's work suggests that reclaiming these patterns isn't regression, but evolution toward more complete and sustainable forms of human development. Your own struggles with feeling unfulfilled despite external success may be symptoms of archetypal disconnection rather than personal failure. The path to authentic satisfaction requires the courage to honor psychological patterns that society may undervalue and the wisdom to integrate them with genuine achievements and meaningful goals. Jung's vision of psychological wholeness suggests that the future depends not on women adopting masculine approaches to success, but on cultures learning to value and integrate the full range of human archetypal capacities. This integration benefits not just individual women, but entire communities that gain access to forms of wisdom and insight that purely masculine approaches cannot provide. The archetype that Jung revealed isn't a limitation to be overcome, but a foundation to be honored, the source of psychological capacities that enable authentic success, sustainable achievement, and genuine fulfillment. Reconnecting with this archetypal foundation doesn't diminish women's capabilities. It reveals capacities for wisdom, insight, and leadership that transcend the limitations of purely rational and competitive approaches to human development.